Hello, how's it hangin'? Today, you and me in RimWorld are going to be surviving countless, so not countless, waves of enemies in Winston waves. We're going to be starting out with quite a few resources, that being steel, wood, some medicine, and also some survival meals, but no components, and also a few other useful things, unfortunately. Every single raid is going to be from the Flood faction. If you're unfamiliar, they're basically zombies, but in space, and even one of their little spores can completely transform a colonist and or pawn into one of their zombies literally within seconds. Much more infectious, if you will. Instead of starting with a couple of soldiers as we did last episode, we're actually going to be starting as a singular UNSC Spartan, meaning that we also have all the augmentations that come along with that. Notably, I did forget to add a joy wire, but I added it before we started. We're mostly just sticking with the bionics and the glands and everything from vanilla RimWorld, that way we're not too overpowered. So without further ado, let us begin. We have 5 days until the first raid of our space zombies are coming this way, so we're going to be building our defenses right off the bat, so we don't have to worry too much about that. We're going to be building some steel armored embrasures, walls, and even a door. As mentioned previously, one of the downsides to this start is not having any components, and we really don't have all that much steel, so we would have to do some mining. That way we could get these resources to go about building a battery as well as a solar powered generator, which I think is going to be more than efficient for our first type of power generation, assuming we make it far enough to have another. For the last few days just before our very first wave of enemies, we were digging out underneath the mountain. You may notice that I'm also kind of digging a shape around our current defensive area, and the reason is we are going to have a backup defensive area in case the first were to fall. But more on that later. As for right now, it would seem that we have our very first wave. Although it's just mostly infection form, so hardly anything to worry about. It also seems that they're going to be preparing for a while before attacking, so I think we should have enough time to continue some mining for a little bit. In case you didn't watch the last video, I should mention that these tend to start out pretty slow, giving us a lot of time to prepare, and then they start hitting us like a damn freight train. So, you know, it might be a little slow to begin here. That being said, though, it would appear that our very first raid has truly begun. The infection forms would approach our armored walls, and they just kind of scratched at them until we eventually popped them all. For our first reward, we're going to choose an orbital bombardment targeter. Now, I realize I probably should start trying to get as many colonists as possible, but in the last video, we noticed that the Flood started some gigantic-ass hives around the map, and we couldn't take them out. So if that were to happen again, I think a targeter is going to be more useful. Thankfully, the cleanup was quite easy. We just started repairing some of our walls before going out and deconstructing some ship chunks. That way we have more resources. We would use these components and the steel to build ourselves 2 little mini turrets. These are not colonists, of course, but they will be able to help us shoot some of these infection forms, making it quite easy to beat the second raid. However, as the second raid was ongoing and we were shooting our enemies and popping them and killing them and yada yada yada, I did notice that one of the carrier forms had come to the door, and yet our turrets were not killing it. Even more so, Axel here, the Spartan, really couldn't kill it either. It looks like we have a few blind spots in our defenses. Nevertheless, though, we did eventually kill it, finishing off wave 2, and we chose a random good reward, which I realize is probably not the best idea, and this was a big mistake because all we got out of it was allies. And the problem there is that we don't have any other factions on the map, just us and the Flood, so we get nothing. Not much we can do about that, but something we can do is fix the blind spots in our defenses, and we're going to be removing the walls that are getting in the way and replacing them with embrasures properly. We're also going out and hunting down the hounds of the Flood. Now, another issue that was mentioned in the last video, but just in case, is that the Flood will actually reanimate corpses around the map before attacking, making it so that even after the raid is complete, we still have quite a few enemies that could infect us and or kill us. Speaking of which, we have wave 3 finally coming our way, which also not too hard, especially given that we have our turrets with us this time around as well, just as with wave 2 of course, but whatever, we won. After completely botching the last reward choice, I decided to choose this time around that we get a colonist who joins us, and this is in the form of someone by the name of Short. Shorty, a civilian with a beer and a pistol. "Welcome aboard, madam. I look forward to surviving and eventually dying and succumbing to an infectious flood in our brains and becoming part of their hive mind together." Alright, here's the problem though. Shorty doesn't have a joy wire stuffed into her cranium, making her happy all the time, so she needs things like accommodations such as a bedroom. She doesn't want to sleep outside around all the space zombies. Ugh. So anyways, we're having to mine out some sections of the mountain here to try and accommodate those requests. Of course though, eventually Wave 4 would come, mostly infection forms and carrier forms. Once again, I told you it'd be a bit of a slow start. We easily ended up killing them all, and it was actually much easier having another person helping us out. For our reward, though the chem fuel drop seemed awful tasty and useful, I thought that weapons might even be better, and I'm glad that I chose weapons, because we ended up getting plenty of Covenant-style weapons, which are going to be absolutely great for frying and searing the dead flesh of the Flood. We would end up spending a good bit of time collecting steel via a nearby deposit. We planned on using all this newly acquired steel to upgrade our defenses, basically just doubling up on our walls and embrasures. Though the infection forms are quite weak, you'll notice they don't do all that much damage. The combat forms that they can create, and that can come later on with the later waves, I suppose you could say, are much stronger. And also the carrier forms, if they get too close to a singular wall and explode, can end up throwing infection forms over. That way, you know, of course we want these to be as thick as possible, so that doesn't happen. For the reward, we would once again choose yet another colonist to try and rack up as many able bodies as we could, realistically. This person also ended up landing with 2 pistols, which may come in very handy, I would think. We were happy to have Erison aboard, especially with her own weapons that she brought, and we would even go about making her a proper bedroom so that she doesn't have a mental break and go crazy. But the issue lies with the fact that we now have more mouths to feed, so we're going to need to start collecting more wild berries and doing more hunting. Luckily, we can actually eat some of the forms of the Flood. Of course, we just have to eat the rotten meat, which doesn't taste all that good, but it will keep us alive, and as long as we don't eat these spores, we shouldn't transform into horrifying monsters. At one point, though, we ended up having a planet-bound shuttle crashing nearby, no doubt attacked by the Flood in some way, shape, or form, or maybe just a malfunction with the ship's computer, I don't know, but we now have a bunch of civilians lying out on the ground about to bleed to death, or even worse, be transformed into zombies. So naturally, the right and moral thing for us to do would be to tend to their wounds and rescue them. We weren't going to capture them, that way we wouldn't have to feed them if they did decide to leave, but if they decided to stay, at least we'd have some able bodies again. Well, as we began putting up some barbed wire around our defenses in an attempt to try to pop the infection forms once they stepped on it, and once the wave finally began once more, we had Luxembourg end up joining us, which I guess actually makes sense that they would join us, because where else are they going to go? We slapped a needler in her hand and sent her to the front line. Welcome aboard, Luxembourg. She would unfortunately have to witness the Flood begin reanimating her dead companions who were laying out by the ship chunks, who we forgot to burn or destroy their bodies. Not that we would have all that much time to grieve, as we had the wave coming right for us, and we would have to try to finish them off first before we could even think about being sad, which we did. For the reward this time around, I went with another random normal reward. I know, Rat Daddy, you were just complaining earlier about doing this, and yes, I'll probably complain now too, but I didn't need any wood, and I didn't want to weaken the wave, because right now they're pretty weak anyhow. That would be something I'd like to have later on, most likely. But anyhow, we ended up having a silver meteorite landing nearby. I guess it'll be good if we want to trade with someone, maybe the orbital traders hub, I don't know. We're now beginning to use a significant portion of our steel every raid to rearm our turrets, and this is only going to be an issue that continues to persist. Regardless of the circumstances though, Axel decided to throw a party, no doubt to try to cheer everyone up of their surroundings and the empty planet full of zombies and themselves, and just to boost morale a little bit. Everyone, I guess, seemed to enjoy it, as I'm sure you probably would have guessed. last, Ray ended up joining us not too long after that as well, so now with our new spacemen a part of our team, we are 5 people strong, significantly boosting our fighting capacity, but not only that, also our working capacity, and that's exactly why we decided to start working on our secondary defensive line. As mentioned a bit earlier, we're mining out some of these portions in this little hallway and replacing them with embrasures. Just in time for Wave 7, I might add, not that we planned on using those secondary defenses at the moment. Once again, those are only going to be if maybe we have too many people overcrowding and we need people to stand back in there, or also, of course, if our first line were to fall. For our reward, we had an excellent reward choice, with that being 5 new colonists joining us. So, of course, we chose this, but they never joined us. I'm not sure what happened here or why nobody joined us after choosing this reward, but it's still just us. Okay, not that we had enough room for them at the moment anyhow. We still had to dig out quite a few rooms for our current group of colonists, which is exactly what we ended up doing just before Wave 8 came around. The Flood would once again arrive and come to try to kill us, and this was about to be business as per usual, but Ariston actually ended up having a mental break and wandered outside our armored walls. We had to rush out and arrest her before she died, and also got the rest of us killed by letting the infection forms in. With the wave complete, we would once again get to choose a reward, this time around it being yet another colonist. This colonist actually ended up appearing by the name of Baka, I believe it is. Now, of course, with all these mouths to feed, the hunting in the area is going to start to dwindle as we kill more and more wild animals, so we need to start growing our own food. We made a small little patch around our defenses to grow some rice, and using plenty of wood from the nearby forest, we would also end up building everyone some proper bedrooms with some end tables and beds, and we'll continue to upgrade these when we can. But Wave 9 has finally arrived, and things are actually beginning to ramp up a little bit. You'll notice that now our enemies are beginning to appear in separate groups with quite a few of their members. This time around, we ended up having 2 groups, and this is only going to continue escalating further and further until we all die. But at the moment, it doesn't seem that our death is at hand just yet. After defeating this wave, we would then request our reward, which was a component drop, 20 normal components and 5 advanced components, which we hope will come in very handy. With all the new items that we're getting and the resources that we're collecting, we need a proper place to store it all, and thus far we've been storing it out in our defensive position, the same place we're growing our food and also making our power, so not exactly ideal if we get a gigantic raid that bursts through. Wave 10, for example, the very next raid that we're going to be facing is going to be a double trouble raid, meaning it's twice as strong, twice as dangerous as what it normally would be. So this is a pretty good candidate for that. Because of this, we would also expend some of the components that we've gotten from our reward last time to make some heavy-duty turrets. But don't look now, because Wave 10 is on its merry little way towards our base. And I'm sure you've already noticed, but we have a substantial more amount of enemies in terms of the infection forms, hound forms, and even their stalker and carrier forms. Thanks to the amount of men that we have, as well as our new turrets and old turrets, this raid wasn't all that difficult, or at least not near as difficult as we initially thought it would be. Once we took out the carrier forms, we had actually won. For our victory reward, we decided to take 5 healer mech serums. Even though I would like some weapons or maybe some food, this seemed like the best option that we could use in a pinch. Now then, even though the raid is over, it's not truly over. As I've mentioned multiple times, they have been reanimating their corpses across the entire region, meaning that we have a lot of hound forms that we would have to go hunt down and kill if we really wanted to be safe in this area, which after every single wave becomes more and more difficult as there are more and more of them. Once we had finally killed a vast majority of those hound forms, though, we would return back to our base to go about fixing up our new storage room once more. We also wanted to go out and hunt some of the large game that was in the area, such as rhinoceri, and the reason for that, not only of course because of their delicious meat that tasted much better than the flood hound form's rotten meat, but also for its leathers. I'm sure you've already seen, but a handful of our members are completely nude, and a few others are just missing a few things like pants or a shirt, and thus we decided to use these leathers to go about making some proper clothing for them, as the flood forms don't actually give us any leathers since they're rotten corpses. Wave 11 was finally here, and along with it would come an orbital bombardment that would plague the entirety of the region. The hive mind of the flood has connections in low places, or in this case high places, as this is most likely some type of station or satellite bombarding the area. During this time, our battery caught on fire due to the fact that, well, I forgot and left it outside in the rain, which was a little bit of a problem because we don't have any sunlight and it was the only thing keeping our turrets on. After taking the battery inside, though, out of the rain, everything was all hunky-dory, except for all the flood coming up to our embrasures, but eventually we would end up finishing them off. And as for our reward, I decided to choose some chem fuel, as it was the only thing that I really thought would be useful given the scenario. Now, if you didn't see the last video where we done this exact same thing with this same modulus as ODSTs and a couple of civilians, you'll know that we had ghouls and stuff like that as well, but they were basically useless because melee combat against the flood ends up in infections, thus as to why they're useless as rewards. And so I assume it would be the exact same thing with shamblers too. Unfortunately, even though we had defeated the last wave, the orbital bombardment of the region would still go on for a long period of time, which wasn't exactly ideal because it was time for us to go out and start hunting down the leftover infection and hound forms before our map becomes completely populated with nothing but them. We ended up reducing their numbers quite a bit, but after all the orbital bombardments had finally stopped, we had some pretty massive forest fires, which were kinda keeping us from running all over the map and finishing off what was left. Plus, we need to focus on prepping for the next wave. Speaking of which, Wave 12 has finally arrived, and thankfully there is no double trouble yet again, meaning that we would be able to finish off the hound, infection, and carrier forms quite easily, I would think. During the battle, we actually had Arison end up joining us once more after we finally recruited her, after we had to take her prisoner a little bit ago, you remember. She was just in time to help us finish off the last remaining remnants of enemies. As our reward, I would choose to have a Xeno-human join us, and funny enough, it would be a Jerohanai, I believe, from the Covenant forces, although they weren't all that aggressive with us, so who knows where they're really from. I do know, however, we almost immediately lost them when an infection form attempted to attack them, but thankfully we saved him. Just in the nick of time, I might add. We didn't really have any more weapons, so we would end up giving this Jerohanai, a space alien from a very advanced civilization, a bow and arrow. Better than nothing. Once again, even though the raid was over, it was time for us to go out in a large hunting group and finish off the remaining enemies that were in the area. That way we could actually travel outside of our base. This was a big mistake that we made last video because I didn't kill off any of the remnants, or at least not a lot of them, and thus we could barely even leave our home. In an attempt to try to keep the infection forms from resurrecting all of their dead colleagues, we would butcher as many as humanly possible. During this time, we also had a cluster of cargo pods carrying weapons drop nearby, and it appeared to be a standard issue UNSC SMG, which we ended up giving to our new brute companion. Wave 13 had finally arrived, and it was during this time that we realized just how ineffectively we were at butchering all of the dead hound forms as they were getting resurrected constantly. In our defense, though, there were far too many to butcher in such a short amount of time. What few that we did manage to butcher, though, it would help out quite a bit, as those would not be resurrected to attack us with the main forces from the wave, making it much easier to fend them off and eventually win the day once more. This time around for our reward, I once again chose chem fuel. Now, an orbital beam targeter would be absolutely amazing, but I would like to build some vehicles at some point, so I need to stock up on fuel. I then began experiencing some issues with the resurrected forms even after the raid once more, before. I know I'm a broken record at this point, but it was actually becoming a much larger issue. Not only that, but also the fact that we were starting to have quite a few mental breaks. We started having some power issues as well, so I decided to build a much larger battery. After I got this done, though, we ended up having Shorty, who was being absolutely mutilated by hound forms nearby. Thankfully, she would end up surviving the beating, and we would come out to attempt to rescue her. During this time, I realized that this very well may have been a plan from the start by the hive mind of the Flood to try and draw the rest of us out, because as we came to try and tend to Shorty, more and more would come to try and attack us. Luckily though, when she was back up on her feet, we would manage to get everyone back home safely. Now, back to our little power issue. Even with a larger battery, it would seem that we're going to need some additional electricity pumped into it to charge it, as you might imagine, so we ended up building a wood-fired generator. Not only will this serve as some additional power for all of our turrets and what have you, but this will also be perfect for emergency backup power if something were to go wrong, like us getting absolutely stomped. Speaking of getting absolutely stomped, Wave 14 has finally arrived, and along with him they have brought some actual combat forms carrying weapons. Not only that, but they also have quite a few tank forms along with them as well. I told you things would start ramping up, didn't I? The combat forms were the first to approach, and they immediately began firing at us, instantly killing 2 of our members. The rest of us instantly began to try to retreat to the inner section to finish off the combat forms. Ray and Baka were basically instantly killed by a rocket fired off, and Luxembourg damn near died herself. This is obviously 100% my fault, and I feel really stupid and really bad for letting it happen. It was so fast, and I guess I had gotten used to all of the easier raids with infection forms prior to this. But either way, a huge blunder on my part. Regardless though, we still weren't done, as we had the tank forms coming right for us. They would easily be able to bust down our walls and doors, so we started focusing our fire directly on them, killing them. Meanwhile, thankfully, Luxembourg seemed as if she would be completely fine, even though many of her body parts were shredded from the Hydra rocket. But this wave was still far from over, as we had many a Flood carrier form sneaking up around the mountain towards the base. As they crept near, some of them got a little bit too close to our walls and bursted, throwing their infection forms over our wall. Only about 1 or so thankfully we could focus fire on it and finish it off before it could infect any of us. But that was a very, very close call. Again, for our reward, we would end up choosing yet another Xeno-human to join us. This time around it was an Impid, but unfortunately the area outside the base was absolutely crawling with infected and hound forms, and they started chasing down our new companion. The problem is, not only are they very powerful, but they are extremely fast as well, and there was no way for me to get our Impid friend here away from them. And eventually he too was infected. Yet another major L for the boys back home. Even with the raid over with, we couldn't even bury our dead in peace because we were constantly being hounded, no pun intended, by the Flood hound forms who were constantly attempting to murder us and or infect us. Indeed, the circumstances around here are starting to become quite dire. Things are becoming much more difficult than they were before. With every single new wave, not only do we face down more and more enemies, but new types of enemies as well, which are much better at countering our defenses than we currently have. So we're going to need to change things up quite a bit. If we have any chance of surviving at all, that is. But since Wave 15 is going to be yet another double trouble raid, I think our chances of survival may have just dropped significantly. But not only is survival the goal and a necessity, it is also, well, our only option. Other than just completely dying, of course. But only time shall tell how we handle the raids and waves that are coming our way. Will we build a base and civilization here that will stand the test of time? Probably not, but I would like to at least survive until wave 30, maybe 100. We'll see. See you later.